We realized last fall or last summer that this was going to be a war of attrition. So then production becomes extremely important. In the beginning, we depleted our stocks to provide support to Ukraine, but our stocks are not big enough, so we need to ramp up production. The reality is that our production capacity is not as big as it should be. That's the reason why we now actually see some good progress in new investments and more production throughout the alliance in EU and non-EU NATO allied countries.
Thirdly, we all agree on the fact that we don't want to fall into a war against Russia, and we want to keep control over the escalation of the conflict as we've done from the beginning of the conflict. So, knowing all of this and knowing that we need and how we can do more in terms of budget, more in terms of military equipment, more in terms of capacity building, and through bilateral agreements like some of us have already signed.
The French president may not have ruled out sending troops to Ukraine one day, but that doesn't appear to be the case for a number of his European counterparts. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz agreed that allies would boost efforts to supply munitions to Kyiv, but sending troops was a red line.
What was agreed from the outset among ourselves and with each other also applies to the future, namely that there will be no ground troops, no soldiers on Ukraine's soil sent there by European countries or NATO states.
In a joint press conference, the Czech and Polish premiers were also categorical.
I will not speak for both of us, but I think I can say for both of us that we're not considering sending any troops to Ukraine.
The NATO chief also said the alliance has no plans to put troops on the ground in Ukraine. Neither does Sweden, which is set to join NATO. A spokesperson for the British Prime Minister said the UK wasn't planning a large-scale deployment beyond the small number of personnel already in Ukraine supporting their armed forces. For Ukraine, though, just the fact that the possibility of direct military intervention was discussed at the meeting of leaders on Monday was good news. The Kremlin, on the other hand, warns that if European members of NATO sent in troops, a conflict between the alliance and Russia would become inevitable.
It seems to me that those who not only express such thoughts, but even allow them in their heads, should use these heads for more rational thoughts, safer for Europe.
Emmanuel Macron said on Monday that although no consensus existed on sending troops, European countries had to do whatever it takes to ensure that Russia did not win the war.
Názor je, že môžeme naďalej pokračovať v zasielaní zbraní, peňazí a techniky na Ukrajinu, ale o 2 roky sa budeme nachádzať na tom istom mieste, kde sa nachádzame teraz. Áno, tu sa rozlišujeme v názoroch. Sú krajiny, ktoré hovoria, že treba posilňovať pozíciu Ukrajiny pre prípadné mierové rokovania. My zase hovoríme, že okamžité zastavenie palby vytvára priestor na okamžité rokovania o určitých kompromisoch a dohodách. Že Európska únia by mala mať vlastný mierový plán. Mala by celou svojou váhou sa zasadiť za ukončenie bojových operácií a za to, aby sa začali rokovania, ako by to celé mohlo vyzerať.
Yeah, Macron has been rebuffed by just about everybody. But you know what? This is exactly the sort of discussion I think President Zelensky and his team here in Ukraine want Western countries to be having. I mean, their argument here is that they're already doing the job of NATO by fighting the Russians on a European frontier. This is what NATO was designed for. And at the moment, they are struggling. They are under real pressure. Of course, they have had to pull out of this key logistics hub called Avdiivka, and I can tell you that in the last couple of days they've also retreated from a couple of villages in the same area, so the situation is critical. I mean, how could NATO troops help? Well, you could send them to the north, to the Belarusian border. That's inactive at the moment. That would free up Ukrainian units to then move to the east to fight the Russians. Is that going to happen? Very, very unlikely. Telling comments, I think, from the German Deputy Chancellor today. He had some advice for France. He said, if you really want to help Ukraine, then send more weapons. They're not going to countenance NATO troops on the ground here in Ukraine. But you know what I think Macron's doing? He's highlighting the gap between what Ukraine has and what Ukraine really what it needs. It is facing critical shortages at the moment. And countries in Europe, the UK as well, they can't meet those shortages on their own. And you know what? The Russians know that, and they are trying to press the advantage right now.
Je ne sais pas si Macron en est conscient, et ça n'a pas l'air de le gêner en tout cas, puisque quand on lui a expliqué que l'armée ukrainienne était truffée de nazis, il n'a jamais réagi. Pourtant c'est documenté, hein, je veux dire, il y a même des reportages de Canal+ qui l'ont démontré, oui, donc ça vient pas de moi. Non seulement il est prêt à ça, mais il est prêt à sacrifier des soldats français pour Kiev, ce qui me paraît délirant. Je veux dire, nous on n'est pas en guerre, c'est l'Ukraine qui est en guerre, c'est pas la France. Donc il est même prêt à donner l'arme nucléaire, il l'a dit, hein, mettre à disposition la dissuasion nucléaire française pour toute l'Union européenne. C'est-à-dire que si demain la Pologne ou la Lettonie est en guerre, on devra utiliser l'arme nucléaire. Mais il est complètement fou. Ce type est fou. Voilà, c'est tout. À un moment, il faut appeler les choses par leur nom. Macron est fou. Donc il est fou furieux. Donc soit on l'arrête, soit on va tous aller en guerre. Mais c'est pas lui qui ira en guerre. Hein. Il va pas envoyer Brigitte faire la guerre. Hein. Il va pas y aller lui-même. Hein. C'est nos enfants et c'est nous-mêmes qui iront en guerre. Voilà.
Moscow says statements like this from the French president raise questions about his adequacy as a leader. In comments to RT, Russia's foreign ministry spokeswoman said Paris should remember its own historical opposition to Nazism.
First, just weeks ago, French President Macron and his representatives denied Paris having any official role in recruiting volunteers or mercenaries, quite a few of whom were on Ukrainian territory. And despite the facts presented by the Russian side, in particular by our ambassador in Paris, the Élysée Palace denied it in every possible way. Then the French president says he is considering sending his military to Ukraine as one of the options. The question arises as to the adequacy of people who make such statements. But it seems to me that the problem is much deeper than that. It is that people who are running things in the EU and France now do not know, and in the context of Paris, do not appreciate their history. I want to remind Mr. Macron that there are other pages in France's history that would be worth Paris turning to now and realizing in the 21st century. For example, the emergence and growth of anti-fascist organizations and inter-French resistance to Nazism during the Second World War, and the joining of citizens and all of civil society in France in the fight against Nazism, against the Third Reich, when it was not an official trend in France. This is what needs to be done now to counteract the rise of Nazism in Ukraine. And we understand very well that enough facts have been provided to make even those who didn't want to believe it to now believe it. So whose side is Macron on? What is this, a ridiculous attempt at hype to make a spectacular statement to gather more hits? Or is it just disrespect for his own heroes, the heroes of France, who gave their lives in the fight against Nazism?
The US and several European countries have denied plans to send soldiers to Ukraine. The same statement was echoed by NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg. Well, that's after French President Emmanuel Macron said he did not rule out putting Western boots on the ground. A French opposition party leader voiced some damning criticism of the president's handling of the conflict.
I think that this is an extremely serious and very irresponsible statement, because sending troops to Ukraine obviously means becoming a belligerent party, means fighting against Russia. France is a nuclear power, like Russia, which means we are talking about the Third World War, let's be honest. So this statement from Emmanuel Macron is very ill-considered and very, very dangerous. But to be honest, I'm not surprised. Perhaps I'm only surprised that he said this now. At first he didn't want to send tanks, then he sent them. He didn't want to send planes, and he certainly will. He didn't want to send long-range missiles, he will obviously send them. This has already been decided, and by the way, it is another stupidity. And now here are the troops. So I'm not really surprised. Listen, Macron has gone crazy, he needs to be stopped. Macron and everyone else, because in this case he is not the only one who says this, pretend that Vladimir Putin wants to attack all the countries of Europe, starting of course with Poland and the Baltic countries, and ending even with France and Germany. They pretend that they don't understand anything, even though Vladimir Putin has dotted the I's many times. In general, they pretend that they don't understand, because they need to create an enemy for themselves, a terrible villain. In fact, they need to create a new Hitler. They definitely need the public to believe that our case is absolutely the same, as in 1939, when Hitler attacked countries one by one. And in order to create an enemy for themselves, so that NATO can justify its expansion, so that the West can justify allocating billions of dollars and supplying weapons, they need justification in the eyes of the public. They need to instill fear.
Well, speaking after a meeting of European leaders in Paris on Monday, Macron said that while they did not agree on deploying any troops to Ukraine, the prospect was openly discussed. But fellow NATO officials were quick to distance themselves from his comments. The French president also attracted criticism from Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova.
First, just weeks ago, French President Macron and his representatives denied Paris having any official role in recruiting volunteers or mercenaries, quite a few of whom were on Ukrainian territory. And despite the facts presented by the Russian side, in particular by our ambassador in Paris, the Élysée Palace denied it in every possible way. Then the French president says he is considering sending his military to Ukraine as one of the options. The question arises as to the adequacy of people who make such statements. But it seems to me that the problem is much deeper than that. It is that people who are running things in the EU and France now do not know, and in the context of Paris, do not appreciate their history.
My colleague Rachel Roux will discuss the French president's proposal to escalate the military conflict with a panel of political affairs experts.
No sane person should even think about this idea what Macron is putting in at the moment. I mean, it is just, I would say, that idea from an unpopular person to put his own nation and put the rest of the Europe not only on the verge of a World War III, rather, I mean, prior to that, it will be an economical turmoil, which, I mean, Europe have already going through worst condition. Europe has to understand that America is using Europe as a proxy against Russia. This is the clear 2+2. Anybody who understands the strategy.
The French president has won by 24% of the votes on the first round. And he came to power not because the population wants him, but because the population didn't want the opposition side. He is someone very frustrated with the French people, and he has been working very hardly to create a larger gap between the interest of the French population and the European population and his ambition. There is no agreement among the European leaders, and there are manifestations in the street of Europe by the agriculture, by all the other people who are extremely unhappy because of the inflation due to the European decision since February 2022.
The French defense minister commented on Macron's statement saying, quote, "To say that we exclude nothing is neither weak nor escalatory." What do you think about the position? Was he basically shrugging off what Macron said?
Sure. Obviously, I think Macron actually broke rank. The idea is not to come out, obviously, outright and say, well, we'll send troops there. Macron is vying for the post of President of the European Union. That's really what it's all about for Macron. And so in that sense, this man is very dangerous because he doesn't really care about the French interest per se. And the problem, what I'm afraid of, is that to the extent, as he says, you know, we may not have to send French troops to fight Russia, but more as a humanitarian. We've seen that before again recently with, you know, French nationals being casualties in Ukraine. So we know there are French soldiers operating there under dubious covers, and sooner or later the idea will be that if we have to sacrifice French troops who are technically, officially presented as non-belligerent, but are nonetheless French troops, you know, official French troops, and they are victim of a false flag, this could then be the casus belli that gets all the members of the alliance involved in Ukraine.